in one of the largest industries in Southern California, certainly its most culturally innovative and influential, the idea that such minuscule percentages of women were getting the opportunity to direct and have employment and tell stories was very disturbing to me. And the numbers were bad enough. Just looking at the data and the research that had already existed, it suggested to me that we needed to do more digging. So when we first got these calls and met with a small group of women, my first instinct was, as it always is, I need to learn more. And I wasn't necessarily thinking like, oh yes, this is the top civil rights problem, I need to be addressing my attention to. There's lots of problems out there in the world. We can only do so many cases or so many advocacy projects. But I have to say, once I really started looking at the data, it was really shocking to me. And what we needed to do was actually start talking to women and get stories because, numbers only tell so much of the story. It was very clear from the numbers that there was discrimination going on. There's a concept in the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court has this concept of the inexorable zero. If the statistics in a discrimination situation, if the statistics are so low, you can basically presume that there is some discrimination happening, that the numbers when I looked at the studies were so low that I thought it was safe to assume that a court would agree that there was a presumption of some discrimination happening. So we decided to launch a story collection project, and we did a lot of different things. We set up a form on our website where people could connect with us anonymously or under a confidential situation and tell their stories. We kind of put out flyers throughout the community through a network of women to say, like, if you think you've been discriminated against or you don't think you've had sort of the same kind of career opportunities that your male peers have, would you be willing to talk to the ACLU? We didn't go out too loudly, to industry events with those, but we kind of passed them out, word of mouth. And ultimately, through a lot of our different efforts, over the course of 2 years, we got to speak with at least 50 women who were willing to come forward and talk to us and tell us in very great detail their stories. Now now we've spoken to many more than that, but within that window, it was about 50 women. And the one thing I will say is that after those stories and looking at the data, it was very clear to me that women in the industry, women directors in the industry, faced very common, very systemic, very repeated barriers to getting employment and getting employment at the same rates as their male peers. And we decided that we had to do something about it. There were a number of reasons that we decided to take this further. The first being that the ACLU thinks employment discrimination is a terrible thing, and that we should have no industry, particularly not very lucrative and influential industries where women are basically shut out. They're severely underrepresented directing television. This was like an employment discrimination problem. But the other reason we felt it very important to devote very limited ACLU resources to this is the much broader cultural impact that bias behind the camera in Hollywood has. There is a direct link between the structural bias that gets replicated in film and television through the bias of most of that being created and made and told through the lens of white men that sinks into us and sinks into our brains, into our beings. It directly impacts how young women and girls see their place in the world, where they see, whether the world has certain opportunities for them or if there are certain limitations. It shapes how boys, think about themselves and see women. All of that stuff matters, and we strongly believe, and the data strongly suggests, that bias behind the camera in Hollywood is directly related to all the other discrimination and bias that we fight at the ACLU in all other facets of life. It's all connected. So we felt it was extremely important to use the ACLU resources and the ACLU, pulpit, so to speak, to address this problem.